All right, Living Environment fans, it's a terrific Tuesday, April 23rd. Of course, hope you had a great Earth Day yesterday. I know I had a good birthday. Of course, it was good because I got to spend some of it with you guys, learning about natural selection. And that's what we'll talk about today. A little more natural selection, and as we work towards the infamous Beaks of the Finches lab. Da 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 do 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 da 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 do do. All right. Da 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 do do do. Hey now. Da 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 do do. Mr. Kovacs class. It's Mr. Kovacs class. You might learn a ton. It's Mr. Kovacs class.
He's interesting too.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
And he's super cool.
It's Mr. Kovacs class. Natural selection, that was Darwin's great idea. I say, that was my greatest idea. Whoa, chap. Right, that was Darwin, natural selection. Aye, chap. That's my best British accent I can do. Mate. And Darwin, in a nutshell, was like, natural selection, there's variation, right, in a population. There's variation in a population. And kind of the average is usually selected for, and that's what he said. Most selection is what we call stabilizing, whereas the outliers, for whatever reason, are not as reproductively successful or survive as well, right? And so they get eliminated, and then the ones that have the best chance of surviving are, he called them the fittest, and that will be what most of the population looks like. Of course, we also saw that one of his ideas was that the environment can change the way a species looks, can shift to what's called directional selection. And we saw this with the peppered moths, the famous peppered moths experiment, right? Where in the forest, the trees were lighter, the light-colored moths did better than the dark ones. They seemed to just blend in better. And then with the Industrial Revolution and the burning of coal, the trees got blackened, and they got blacker and blacker and blacker. And after a period of time, the trees had changed. Therefore, the moths that fit had changed. And the natural selection started choosing the darker colored moths who were then more successful. So the population shifted, right? Shifted from one thing to another due to selective pressure. And of course, what Darwin thought was most interesting, what we all think is most interesting, is that if you could get selection to shift populations in two directions, eventually that's how you'll get two new species, right? We call that diversifying selection. And I talked about a lot of examples yesterday during my Bellringer during class, but selection, right, is where you get selection to one end or the other end of the spectrum, and that will like split the population in half, right? It's disruptive selection. You wind up with two new things that are closely related. I mean, Darwin always said that in natural selection, you're going to get species that were, although different from each other, still pretty closely related to each other, right? And then over time, you get more and more branching out of this tree of life, with each new branch is formed by natural selection. That's that in a nutshell. That leads us to the finches, right? The famous finches. And we're going to be spending a lot of time with finches for the rest of the week. The finches, of course, are called Darwin's finches, even though Darwin, he collected some finches but didn't really pay much attention to them. Most of the studies of the Galapagos finches were done by a couple named David and Rosemary Grant, who are from Princeton University, who studied finches on the Galapagos for many, many years and were able to measure changes in beak sizes, right? So different islands, of course, the idea that Darwin had was that different islands had different beak sizes because of the food, right? And so he's part of his tree of life was that there must have been an original finch that came to the Galapagos, right, and landed on a bunch of the islands, but each island was slightly different than the other in terms of what food was available and what you needed to open the food. So that on islands where there was like hard seeds, if your beak was a little bit bigger and a little bit stronger than your neighbors, you would survive and have more offspring, and their beaks would be bigger and stronger. But on an island where there might just be cactus flowers, having a big, strong beak isn't as important as having a long, skinny, probing beak, right? And so he said natural selection would have acted on each of the islands, right? And so anyway, on the Regents, you will always see the famous Darwin Finch's wheel, right? We will definitely see this on the Regents. And they're going to ask you questions about what if, right? See how it's like, here are the different finches on the outside, and then on the inside of the wheel, it shows what traits they had, right? What kind of bills they had, what kind of food they eat. And then you'll always be asked, like, what if a new bird were to land on this island, what would happen to their beaks, you know, like, okay? And so anyway, you need to be able to read this wheel. Let's do a little practice. Good. It's not that hard to read the wheel, really. You just gotta, right? Notice that, like the large ground finch, it's got biting tip, grasping beak, mainly animal food. There you go, large tree finch. All right, so we'll continue talking about natural selection and Darwin for the next few days, and then we're going to talk a little bit about history of life on Earth as seen in the fossil record, which is probably the biggest support of Darwin's idea of natural selection when you start looking at fossils. See that things have changed, and it's fun looking back to see how life on Earth has changed over time. Anyway, let's do today's Bellringer, finish it up, today's Ed puzzle, and then, yeah, we'll get into class.